The Soviet version of the war's memory is not the same as the Russian Putinist version of the war's memory. And this is a very important point when it comes to Ukraine.
How different is the Soviet and Putinist recollection of World War II compared to what actually happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I should say that the Soviet and now sort of Putin era narrative of World War II or the Great Patriotic War, it does stand on a sort of bed of undeniable truth that the Red Army sort of bore the brunt of the European fighting and Soviet citizens and sort of Russians numerically above all paid an enormous human price to defeat Nazism. But what the Kremlin is presenting is not history, but a sort of particular form of historical memory. Therefore, it's highly selective, a sort of edited version of the past that is shaped and informed by, present day concerns. And so historians reconstruct the events of the past by weighing the totality of the archive and the available evidence. And this includes laudable aspects of the past as well as shameful aspects. Memory cultures, on the other hand, they do the opposite. They highlight chapters that affirm national identity and kind of sideline those that jar with it, that don't fit with it perfectly. So I should say every country does this to some extent. I grew up in the American school system. And yeah, when we studied World War II in history class, we studied the Normandy landings of June 1944. We studied the Battle of the Bulge, these victories. But not many American students today can talk about the Battle of Kesarine Pass, for example, which was the first time U.S. and German troops met in an engagement. Well, why don't we know that in America of this battle? Because it was an American defeat. So even in America, we have a somewhat selective view of the past. So all states do this. What I would say is, though, Russia's approach is not unique in kind, but it is unique in its scope and in its sort of maximalization of and weaponization. So the wartime story is sort of pressed into service as a master narrative for domestic legitimacy, and today, as we're seeing, to justify an aggressive war. The Soviet version of the war's memory is not the same as the Russian Putinist version of the war's memory. And this is a very important point when it comes to Ukraine.
And so, what are some of the main major points that aren't typically presented in a Soviet or Putinist recollection of the war?
So on the surface, for the Putin era war memory, you see the symbols appropriated by the Putinist government. So you have the military parades, you have the sacred date, May 9th, as Victory Day, and you have this sort of reflex of branding the West. Fascists, these are all continuities with the Soviet era, but the differences really matter, and I'd argue that they're somewhat paramount. In Soviet memory, while it was tightly orchestrated and choreographed, it was officially supra-ethnic, right? Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Armenians, and others were celebrated as co-victors alongside the Russians. Putin's version strips away this multinational frame, and the victory becomes a sort of specifically Russian inheritance. And the heroism of former Soviet peoples, it's acknowledged only when it can be folded into a larger Russian story, or in the case of Ukraine, recast in sort of collaborationist, nefarious terms. In short, the myth is kind of rooted in genuine sacrifice. It's based on real heroism and tragedy and things like this, but it's selective retelling turns history into a kind of political weapon rather than a critical account of the past. And so I really want to differentiate between the Soviet version of the past and the Putin version that we're seeing now, because they portrayed Ukraine in very, very different terms.
I wasn't aware of like that difference between that much difference between the Soviet and the Putinist versions. But so, what are the? Can we just go into like the way that the Soviet memory of Ukrainians' contribution differs from the Putinist version?
Absolutely. Interestingly, in the 1960s, when Soviet scholars and propagandists and people like this were coming together to write the official history of the Great Patriotic War, it was this monumental six-volume work, and it was to replace the official history of the war, which was really a collection of Stalin's speeches called On the Great Patriotic War. So in this process, which takes place from Stalin's death in 1953 up until the very early 1960s, you have these commissions that meet and debate the nature of the war, what the official narrative is going to be, and post-Stalin narrative, and so on. In one of these issues, they had a photo of Nazi collaborators who were Red Army troops of some sort. And it turned out that all of these quote unquote collaborators, it actually was a clip from a Nazi propaganda photo. So it was totally misattributed. But somebody said that these are Ukrainian soldiers who are surrendering to the Germans. Well, it turned out this was completely false, right? This is from a Nazi propaganda photo, and it caused a big scandal internally within this commission that was writing this history. And they said, no, 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 Ukrainians fought just as heroically as every other people. Why are we singling them out in this image here? And so it led to a real debate. And out of this debate, which I sort of track, in my past research, out of this debate, it was decided that we're going to promote this multi-ethnic inclusive Soviet version of the war's memory, specifically out of this question of how do we portray the Soviet multi-ethnicity? How do we portray Ukrainians in here? Were they equal with Russians, or were they somehow subservient to Russians in this war effort? And it was decided very clearly that they're going to be co-equals, co-victors, co-authors of the victory over Nazism. And so this is, I mean, not many people do know this because they assume the post-Soviet or the Putinist Russian memory is basically the Soviet version continued, but it's not. There's a really, what Putin's doing is nationalizing the war's memory. It's making it Russian, and this process inevitably excludes the multi-ethnic patriotism and Ukrainians in particular in this case.
Your support is central to help us keeping the world informed about what's at stake in Ukraine. Consider becoming a member to help the Kyiv Independent provide locally produced journalism from Ukraine to the world. If you spoke to somebody in like the US or the UK and like the idea of changing the perception of World War II over a generation or two, like it seems almost ridiculous. Like, so how has Putin gone about doing that?
Various ways. I mean, state-owned, state-controlled media, for example, cultural initiatives, films. Really, it's the sort of politicization of news, media. I mean, we have this. This is a problem all over the the developed world right now. Museum displays that are heavily curated. The state has backed films about the Great Patriotic War. Famously, the 28 Pamphilov Guardsmen, it was a film that came out several years ago, partly supported by state funds. And interestingly, this unit, the 28 Pamphilov Guardsmen, it famously was multi-ethnic. It was famously a representative of, not just Russians, but there were other representatives of Soviet peoples there, non-Russians. And so in the Soviet period, it became a story of multi-ethnic harmony and friendship between nations and so on. It came out that this story was almost entirely fabricated, right? Even in the Soviet era, it was journalists basically invented it as a sensationalized account to promote patriotism and to help mobilization. The story has come back, and there's aspects of the multi-ethnicity there, but it's much more a Russian national story. And this, as I said, was promoted by state funding. And so this sort of thing, media, culture, youth clubs, where you're sort of instilled in these sort of the mystique, the history of this highly politicized version of the Great Patriotic War, all of these means are gradually. And by the way, memory laws that prohibit the so-called falsification of history. This is another thing that began in the Soviet era, but these laws also are intended to steer. The public's perception and cultural producers, political producers, the way they shape this narrative of the Great Patriotic War.
It seems almost quite like 1984-esque in terms of like rewriting history. Is that sort of a fair comparison?
In some sense, it is. You have this idea that he who controls the past controls the future, and so in this sense, history is very what we call history. Our understanding of the past, it shapes a nation's identity, and so it's very, very important for nationalists, for rulers, politicians, and so on to have a version of the past that would help preserve national cohesion, that would help bolster a patriotic sense of what it means to be part of this imagined community of Russians. And this is especially true in times of upheaval and crisis, times of war, times when, you're kind of a global pariah because of your actions. This is precisely when you want to emphasize your shared past because it reinforces your national identity, your sense of purpose. I mean, this is the function of historical memory in general. But what I'll add to this, though, is what's often missed with this kind of Orwellian comparison. It's not that there's, okay, there's this memory hole, where you're incinerating old textbooks, and there is an element of that. I think what's in sort of contemporary, sort of propagandistic historical narratives, what's kind of really nefarious about them is that they do rest on these sort of real historical events. And so it's more about aspects of nuance. It's more about what are we going to highlight, what are we going to emphasize, and what are we not going to emphasize, what are we going to downplay, rather than it is about pure invention. And you mentioned briefly, like, what are the areas that they're not mentioning, and these are important. So there's kind of three areas. There's the sort of pre-war complicity, and so the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact is something that is really downplayed. I mean, this clashes with the kind of ideal of uninterrupted anti-fascism. Where you have this period from 1939 until 1941 when the Soviets and the Germans were in a non-aggression pact, and the Soviets actually, provided materiel and training and things like this for the Blitz, for example. And so it's not a matter of pure invention. It's something that rests on, and so downplaying these things, downplaying the brutal costs and compromises that were carried out in the name of victory. You have the massacre of tens of thousands of Polish troops at Katyn, in 1940. The blocking detachments, Stalin's order, not one step back. These sorts of things. Quite brutal policies put into place to assure this victory. And then, of course, you have things that have long been downplayed, like the mass rapes of women in Central Europe during the Red Army's liberation, and things. These things are just not mentioned. And if they are, for example, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, they're framed in a way that Stalin was sort of forced into this situation, and that he had no choice in these sorts of things. So you have these negative, less than heroic aspects of the war that are downplayed. Simultaneously, you have an exclusive focus on this kind of sanitized heroism that is nonetheless real. And so people absorbing this sort of thing say, "Oh, well, there is a lot of truth here, so this whole narrative must be true." But it's more about the selectivity of how this narrative is presenting, which again is not history; it's a form of historical memory and myth.
Bring us up to date with what's happening in the world today. I mean, the idea of rewriting the history of World War II for a Westerner in the US or UK seems absolutely ridiculous. But are there any sort of parallels that we've seen with like the Trump administration and the way in which perhaps like the Capitol riots are recalled and the 2020 election?
You absolutely have a similar sort of impulse there. So why is the U.S. why would the U.S. government be doing this? Why would they? And so you mentioned the Capitol riots and January 6th and these sorts of things as well. In that case, I mean, this was on television. You had politicians coming out immediately after this and denouncing it as an insurrection. A year passes, more time passes, and all of a sudden you get a revision of this narrative that is within living memory. I mean, you can watch it on television, the violent aspects of this. And yet there is a critical mass of citizens in the United States that are simply rejecting this. I mean, I've heard politicians saying that, this was basically like a bunch of tourists visiting the Capitol. It was nothing stranger than that. I mean, this is somewhat shocking, but what it is people subsuming their personal memories and recollections to a larger political narrative, right? And so, if we think that, well, how could Russians believe, what they're doing in Ukraine is fighting Nazis, and how could, these sorts of things? Well, we're witnessing it right now. There's a real power to state-driven narratives and official myths, especially when they appeal to people's sense of patriotism and duty. So absolutely, World War II is hugely, in a more subtle way. Up to this point, it's been very politicized in the United States as well, and other countries. All countries have their national myths about the meaning of World War II, which were developed in a Cold War context. We're only now coming to terms with that aspect of it, I think. But yeah, if look no further than things that are going on in the United States and other countries in the West, to see how these individual memories and beliefs and moral compasses are subsumed to larger political narratives.
As a historian who's obviously studied these types of things, but also as an American, like how concerned are you about this happening right now?
Well, I'm very concerned about it. In the United States, there's been a real attack on history. There's been moves by the current presidential administration to emphasize teaching patriotic civil values, patriotic education, which is a very Soviet thing as well. And so that's not history. That's, again, like the Putinist war myth, that is a particular version of historical memory, a distortion of the, or and myth, a distortion of the past, not saying it's all untrue, but just saying it doesn't take in the totality of evidence. And there were Soviet people in the 1960s who saw this narrative being created. Konstantin Simonov, for example, he wrote to the political leadership saying, "How is it any less patriotic showing the difficult defeats that we experienced in the first days of the war in 1941? How is that less patriotic than if we simply deny that it happened? How is that more patriotic?" His point, of course, is we overcame these defeats eventually to win, to defeat Nazism, and in a way, that's very patriotic in itself. So I come from a perspective where I think looking at the totality of the past, the good as well as the bad, it can be more patriotic to understand our history that way, to look at the challenges, to look at the ways we need to constantly improve and be on guard for these types of negative aspects of our history. If you just deny it, you're no longer, guarding against it happening again. In fact, you're assuring that these kind of things will happen again. The same is true, of course, for the war narrative that's being stoked in Russia. I'll add just one thing, though. There's a bright side to this as well. Historical memory is not always negative. It can also preserve a sort of positive sense of national identity and your place in the world. And I'll just point to a few instances during the Cold War. During moments of détente between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were actually partnerships when they got together and they celebrated that old alliance that defeated Nazism and fascism in World War II. And so the war's memory can be used not just as a weapon against Ukraine or as a way to sort of stifle dissent domestically, but it can also be used as a memory of cooperation. It can be used as a narrative of, the joint struggle against, an unimaginable evil. So, and you do see this popping up as well. And you saw this, even under Putin in the 21st century. You saw moments where the war's memory was used in more beneficial ways, in ways that acknowledged partnership and these sorts of things. And to me, that's more patriotic than just denying the negative aspects of the past.
Consider becoming a member and help the Kyiv Independent provide locally produced independent journalism from Ukraine to the world.